Hello, I wish to register a complaint about this TV show I bought from you not 5 years ago. Oh yeah, what's wrong with it? I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead, that's what's wrong with it. Nah, it's resting. Look, my lad, I know a dead TV show when I see one, and I'm looking at one right now. Nah, it's resting. Remarkable TV show, Doctor Who. Lovely nostalgia there. Nostalgia don't enter into it. It's stone dead. Nah, it's stunned. Look, my lad, I've had just about enough of this. That TV show is definitely deceased. And when I bought it not 5 years ago, you assured me its lack of movement was due to it being tired and shagged out after a long period of chibnall. Well, it's got to be pining for all the returning villains, bringing back Sutek and the Rani and all that. Pining for returning villains? What kind of talk is that? Look, I took the liberty of examining this TV show, and the only reason your version of it had any success at all in the first place was anniversary nostalgia. Well, of course I had to ease them in with anniversary nostalgia, or everyone would have got confused. Look, matey, this TV show isn't confusing anyone anymore, because no one's watching it. It's bleeding demised. This TV show is no more. It has ceased to be. It has expired and gone to meet Sydney Newman. This is a late TV show. It's a stiff, bereft of life, it rests in peace. If you wouldn't use anniversary nostalgia, it would have been dead then and there. It's run down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-TV show. Well, I better resign then. Doctor Who is dead. About 2 weeks ago, inconveniently for me, a mere 2 days after I released my last video about the Series 1 finale, where it had become quite useful to talk about, but never mind, the BBC officially confirmed the 2026 Christmas special was no more, that Russell T Davies' second tenure on the show was at an end, and that the show was being put on ice for the foreseeable future. None of this came as a particular surprise to anyone. It felt more like a calling of the time of death for a show that had been dead for the best part of a year anyway. And while the BBC are officially shopping the show around to independent producers, I think it's unlikely anyone wants this particular poison chalice, and I suspect everyone involved knows that. So it's either some random CBeebies animated series that nobody cares about, least of all kids, and this is it for the foreseeable. And well, I can't speak for everyone else, but while I was disappointed that the show had let itself reach this point, I can't say I'm particularly sad that we're here now, particularly with how disastrous RCT2 ended up being, with that embarrassment of a finale last year, and those insulting final moments. I had no interest in seeing a continuation of it, and furthermore it's pretty clear interest among the general public in Doctor Who is at an all-time low, and the only thing that is going to heal that is time. Everyone's saying the show needs to come back in 2 or 3 years. No. It needs to be the other side of 2030, and to be honest, probably closer to 2035. It needs to wait until people want it back. Until people are sitting around going, do you know what I think would be great if they brought back? Doctor Who. And after all, that's what happened the first time around when the revival came back. The show that had reached a point where nobody outside of its fan base really cared in 1989 was a long way enough away for people to look back fondly and want it back. It's funny to compare the two cancellations of Doctor Who and how different they are. In 2026, Doctor Who was at a creative and popular low, the fans pessimistic at best about its creative direction, and frankly the sense I've got from the fan base is apathy at this news. Well, we're back to the wilderness years, it was a fun run while it lasted. Whereas in 1989, Doctor Who was finally finding itself again. After the travails of the mid-80s, it knew what it wanted to be again. It was far from perfect, but the improvement was there. But a total lack of support from the BBC and a simple disinterest of the general public meant its end was inevitable. And the fan base kind of lost their minds at that. What they had known forever, Doctor Who on TV, was no more. And unlike this time around, where the fans would have no shortage of Doctor Who, 60 years of TV, audios, comics, books, etc., all available at the click of a finger thanks to the internet, in 1989 there was nothing like that. Expensive VHSs, a Doctor Who magazine every month, and some soon-to-be adult, read juvenile, books that tied everyone along, and that was it. So it's understandable why the reaction has been so different, and yet it's difficult not to come to the conclusion that the show was ending in 1989 on a far more positive note. Though the promise of further adventures for the Doctor and Ace, even if we wouldn't see them on TV, the setup was always there, and with the passion of fans to continue the story through said comic books, comics, and eventually audios. It meant there had been built up a group of fans who had become writers in the wilderness years who would eventually run NuWho. arguably to its detriment, as it clearly became a bit of a clique and elevated lesser writers who simply could not produce good material of any consistency for TV, mentioning no Gareth Roberts in particular. But leaving that aside, the fact the story was always to go on meant that there was that possibility, that ability for things to continue in one way or another. Contrast how NuWho ended, a hastily and botched re-editing of an already woeful finale to cover up that the main star had decided to leave because of how badly the show was being run. I don't think that's a pretty obvious conclusion at this stage. To leave us with no promise of further adventures, no promise that Doctor Who always went on, but shoved in a bizarre out-of-nowhere Doctor with an actress who was clearly only doing it as a favour to RTD in extreme circumstances. How is anyone going to write anything with Billie Piper playing the Doctor? There's nothing to go on, no personality, no characters, no ideas, and frankly, no writer is going to try and make her into a proper Doctor in spin-off material, knowing that any future revival of the show will almost certainly just wipe the slate clean and start again with a new actor, so there's no point for starting anything new. We could just keep filling in the gaps in the old, but Big Finish have already become a shadow of their former selves. Their reinvigoration of the fanbase is now much less likely, with increasingly aging actors from the classic series and unconvincing impressionists making up the lineup for those who have died in the interim. The future, whatever it holds, will look very different, and perhaps lessons from Wilderness Years 1 will have to be unlearned for Wilderness Years 2. Which brings us to Survival, the final story of the classic series and the subject of our review today, and another area in which the 1989 cancellation wins is its final story. The final story of NuWho was a complete and total unmitigated disaster, one of the most appalling stories I've ever seen, and it's only the fact there was once a story where a moon was once an egg that prevents it from being the worst NuWho has ever had. Survival, on the other hand, was very far from perfect, but it was nevertheless a mostly effective and enjoyable piece that provides a solid cap on the classic series as a whole, and frankly a perfect cap on the Seventh Doctor's era, being entertaining and frustrating in equal measure. It ends up as a good story, but it's elementary mistakes that keep it from being great, and that's a shame. That's the thing though, the Seventh Doctor's era made a lot of mistakes, there's no question, and we'll go through a lot of them, but they are easier to forgive because they aren't making the same mistakes over and over again, like in the mid-80s, and frankly like NuWho did for 20 solid years, which I personally think was probably a larger factor in the decline than most give credit for there, but never mind. The Seventh Doctor's era, however, learned from them. They focused less on gimmicks and producers' whims, it was more back to storytelling and not become a media phenomenon, good job on that, JNT. They didn't see an idea work once and decide to imitate it over and over again, like the violence in the Caves of Androzani being poorly replicated in Season 22, which just came across as senseless and callous. And they were happy to try new things, often with poor effect. Most of Season 24 remains an awful season, but Doctor Who and the JNT have become so conservative, not politically obviously, but in terms of its approach. It seemed there were few opportunities to do something new, and when that did happen and succeeded, they were imitated on their own ideas. See that point about Androzani. And the self-referential nostalgia bait, which I'm sure everyone these days is not familiar with at all, cough cough, R2D2, but back in the 80s that led to stuff like Attack of the Cybermen, a confusing and convoluted sequel to two stories which had been broadcast 2 decades earlier and were missing at the time, and stuff like that was just straight up jettisoned in the McCoy era. They weren't making the same mistakes, and that is to be praised. And indeed, that Andrew Cartmel, who, let's be honest, was in charge in all but name from Season 25 and going forwards, and the difference in approach between JNT and him is obvious. Learned from the disaster of Season 24 and steered well away from that approach is a good sign it was being taken on board. But there were mistakes of their own, and as if predicting NuWho's approach, it was frustrating they could not find a way to learn from these mistakes. Andrew Cartmel was bad at editing scripts, which is a problem when his job title is script editor, which meant they would always be far too long and end up having to be butchered in the editing suite and also bring things within the broadcast time. Ghostlight should be a brilliant story, but as broadcast it's an incomprehensible mess. The standard of the directing had slipped quite a bit, with some stories on as being sloppy. The Curse of Fenric for me is far more effective on paper than it is on screen because of the disjointed and messy feel it has in production. The music was very hit and miss, sometimes it was very good, and sometimes it was done by Kev McCulloch, and every story he did has his atmosphere completely ruined. Cartmel was frequently too guilty of prioritising his overall master plan. Long-term storytelling is fine, but not at the expense of the here and now, particularly when it was so obvious Doctor Who was on the edge of the cliff. And the politics were oh so very unsubtle. And these are all problems, all issues I have with this era, and why it's never going to be some loved, top-quality era for me, but as I made very clear, they are their own problems, that they learnt from the old ones, and hey, in the end, Season 24 was a mess and a false start. Realistically, Cartmel only had 8 stories to get this to work. Who's to say those issues wouldn't have been ironed out had he had more time? And that's it for me. It wasn't there yet, but it was the show finding itself again, and that in itself is positive enough to end the classic series on a high. At the time, it must have felt so annoying for the show to be curtailed like that, but in hindsight, we see it's very unlikely it would have survived long into the 90s anyway with how TV changed. So I think we can be happy that Survival ends everything on a positive note. But how positive? Well, let's see. Firstly, the production, and this story was directed by Alan Wareing. Wareing was an exclusively late McCoy era director, doing The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Ghostlight, and this story. In fact, because he directed both Ghostlight, the last produced story of the classic series, and this story, obviously the last aired, he is, however you cut it, the last director of the classic series. I already spoke about his work on Greatest Show when I reviewed it a while ago, and said that there was an okay job, and the same applies here. It's one of the better McCoy era directing jobs, as it avoids any weird and awkward bits and generally flows quite well. For instance, both cliffhangers, usually a bit of a trip up for McCoy-era stories, are well timed and don't feel abrupt or anticlimactic as they often can, and Wareing keeps up the pace even when the script sags in its later parts. It doesn't lose the energy. And well, in case I haven't made it clear, the McCoy-era standards on this are not great, so the fact that it actually feels like it's cut somewhat competently brings it a notch above the rest of it. Cough, cough, Fenric, cough, cough. On the other hand, though, Wareing does fumble the staging for most of the action sequences, so it just feels like we're watching people run around for a while in a way that gets very old very quickly, and well, I'm not sure why he thought that slightly deepening his voice would be all that what was needed to disguise the Master before the end of Part 1. Anyone who recognises Ainley would know that it was him instantly. And yet the cliffhanger only works if you recognise the Master on sight, so overall though it's an okay job, and again I'm just thankful it ends up coherent as a whole because this era often didn't. Other parts of production, for reasons I'll get into in a bit, this was shot entirely on location, so no sets to speak of, but the location scouting was a good quality. While the Cheetah Planet is very much a BBC quarry, it's a well-chosen BBC quarry, and shows how far the BBC quarry had come by 1989. It's helped by Wareing maintaining a good sense of atmosphere, to make this place feel as barren and hopeless as it should, and I also think it's a good contrast with the bit of the real world we see as urban London, which helps avoid associating it with sort of our real world in more than we should. It's held by advances in special effects, meaning that they can add an orange sky and reflections of that in the water and stuff like that, so that helps. Speaking of which, the special effects are alright. Stuff like that and the yellow eyes work decently. The Kittling effect, on the other hand, is pretty bad. Apparently the animatronic people couldn't make a cat work as well as a dog, and it would have been a dog that had impressed the production team's attention to get the job in the first place, so Overall though, it's fine. It's the classic series after all, we don't judge on such things. The soundtrack is excellent, no anti-atmosphere kef crap here. This is moody, atmospheric and effective music. Yeah, the electric guitar's cheesy, but it's also cool as fuck, so what can you do? Overall, for the McCoy era especially, it's pretty good, if not a perfect production. So to the script. This story was written by Rona Munro, for whom this was her classic series debut, and therefore finale given the obvious, but she did return a mere 28 years later to write for series 10 of NuWho with The Eaters of Light, making her the first and only person to have written for both classics and NuWho. We'll gloss over that series 10 was when the long ratings decline of NuWho really began to sit in, and assume it's just a coincidence rather than Munro being a jinx or anything, but we'll move on and say the script to this story is okay, decent. I get the annoying feeling how it probably could have been a lot better than it was if it were not for some rather elementary issues, a lot of which unfortunately have Cartmel's fingerprints all over them. See, there was a problem I mentioned that Cartmel, while a great ideas man and overall had a good grasp on storytelling, was not very good at the script editing part of his job, which was called script editor. This means several stories of the story overran significantly, weren't trimmed down and reworked before filming as they should have been, and then ended up having to be butchered in the editing suite to make sure it actually fit the broadcast slot. This has been confirmed to be an issue for Ghostlight and the Curse of Fenric, and for reasons I'll get to later, I strongly suspect this was the case here as well. A lot of the issues, though, stem from the format as well. See, Doctor Who in the McCoy era had 14 episodes a season, but this was split into two full 4-part stories, both studio and location, then a 3-part story only in the studio, and then another one only on location. For instance, in this season, Battlefield and The Curse of Fenric are the 4-parters with both studio and location, while Ghostlight was the 3-parter in the studio, and this story was the 3-parter on location. I think another aspect of why the scripts could feel so poorly edited was bad selection in that respect. I think it's pretty obvious that this story was a far better contender for the full length from being full length probably realised in Battlefield, which is a bit of nonsense that would have been probably much improved by being a tighter 3-parter on location. Ideally, of course, Ghostlight would have been extended, that would have been a far better candidate than this story and badly needed it, but I don't see how Battlefield could have been realised entirely in the studio, which does sort of belie the problem that decisions led to odd outcomes that did have to be made. So I want to make it clear I appreciate this was not an easy thing to unwind, but it nevertheless does lead to the story feeling like it has to rush through so much of its plot, and it feels like it's not quite finished in the oven yet. That's why I say it's frustrating that I feel like it could have been quite a bit more than it is, because it just feels like it's these elementary mistakes that keep this as it is, especially when the ideas are so imaginative and themes and characters so effective. I'll start, however, by talking about all the things I do like about the story, of which there are quite a few. First of all, I like the ideas behind it, without a doubt. They're quite unique and original and well thought out. The ideas are, in theory certainly, quite coherent, and do give this an interesting thematic link. And while the idea of cat people isn't necessarily new as an idea in Doctor Who, it had been suggested at least once before for unproduced stories, its arrival on TV does have an air of seriousness to it I think makes the inherent silliness of the concept is overcome very easily, and it's a praiseworthy skill to make that work. NuWho also did cat people, and they didn't really work at all, because NuWho's ability to turn a silly concept into something serious and engaging is roughly on par with the ability of the average human being to shit gold bricks. And I think it says in its last story, the classic series demonstrates on one of its great strengths, that only at its very worst did it fail to take itself seriously, and it always tried to make the best of its concepts by engaging with them, rather than saying, "Here, funny concept," and leaving it there. While I do have a few problems with the execution, I think the cheetah people are an effective threat, but also one with a bit of nuance to them. This allows them to be both a huge threat to our heroes, a deadly one to be taken seriously, and one where we can wince when one or two get stabbed to death at various points in the story. Another strength of the story is the thematic content. Well, very obviously it deals with the idea of the survival of the fittest, hence the title, and examining that further through the ideal of that drive for survival and separating man from animal, and indeed blurring that line. I do like that everyone in the story can arguably be said to be acting purely for survival at points, even the Master when you break it down, and it shows how different people react to that fight or flight kicking in. The Doctor methodically working the situation, running the scenarios in his head, and hiding his own desperation through his calm exterior and intelligent thinking. Ace is proactive and determined and refuses to give up no matter what, while her friends have the varying degrees had their spirits broken. The Master is driven by his desire for power and his hatred of the Doctor, and both of those derive from his own innate need and wish for survival. I like that this drive is therefore shown as being both a positive and a negative. The human nature almost always is, and then while it can bring out the best of us, like in showing Ace's abilities, it also drives paranoia, aggressiveness, brings us closer to animal than man. And it's surprising how balanced this manages to be considering it's the McCoy era. Patterson's first scene, for instance, shows him pushing his self-defense students to the limit and actively making one beat the shit out of another, even though the fight was effectively over. But it's not because he's a sadist or because he enjoys the violence or dominating them, as we see when he picks up the loser and makes sure he's alright afterwards. He honestly believes that this is helping them, nurturing those instincts that is going to help them to survive, and it leads to a more rounded character and more rounded idea. I also like that the story doesn't pull its punches with this sort of thing either. In the opening scene we see the poor lad washing his car get whisked away, expecting to see him later and form part of the gang that gets rescued at the end and reunited with his mother. Well, Ace certainly finds him. His corpse, that is. And despite us seeing his child's sister and it being established he's a friend of Ace, Midge still dies at the end. It shows that both the story and its theme can have real tragic consequences, and that there's no everybody lives ending here. Another strength of the story is the character work. Ace, I think, is a really great story. It really shows how her arc has culminated in becoming far less reckless but no less energetic and proactive. How she's able to rally her exhausted friends through her steel and determination, and shows that the Doctor has ironed out her rough edges without losing what made her her, without losing her beliefs or her system of beliefs. You know, if she had some Nitro 9, she'd be using the hell out of it on the Cheetah planet, but in service of a clear goal, which is using her intelligence and guile as well as her strength of character to work out. Aldred has already made the role her own at this point, and obviously she'll become no stranger to revisiting her over the next 35 years, and really manages to walk the fine line between being the adventurer and the every woman that the character is meant to be. And then of course there's the Master. In one of JNT's rare good interventions, he suggested this story should have a named villain, so at least one of the stories of this season, which they probably all knew was a good chance of it to be the final one, would. And I think bringing the Master into this story was a stroke of genius, as he fits the plot like a glove. Harnessing a force that he is trying but not always succeeding to control certainly is vintage Master stuff. He fits the thematic stuff as I mentioned and plays off very well against the 7th Doctor. His being just as opposed to the Master as any other Doctor despite being that dark and manipulative Doctor is a nice contrast. And McCoy is able to let slip in his performance that the Master isn't just another enemy for him but a more personal one. And yet the 7th Doctor's walls, we never see them drop. It is of course often pointed out that Anthony Ainley is finally allowed to perform the Master as he always wanted. Darker, more serious and subtle, a manipulative schemer, a mirror of this Doctor of course, ruthless and immoral without being a cartoon as he had to be because of JNT having the creative judgment of a hedgehog. It's not just that the silly over-the-top stuff is toned down, as we did see this quite a lot of the time in this Master's more effective scenes, like when he's being burned in Planet of Fire, or for instance, or when the Valiard reveal in the Trial of a Time Lord. They were all great scenes where he was toned down from the moustache twirling a bit, but here I think it's all the more effective because Ainley is finally allowed to be his own Master. Always in the earlier stories, it felt like he was being just told to do an impression of Delgado. A well-interpreted impression, and Ainley's charm always carried the performance, but it rarely felt more. Here that's gone. Finally rid of that ridiculous tree mask costume that made him look like he was wearing pyjamas, he escapes Delgado's shadow in style. His master does have less of the charm, but it is replaced by an edge of menace, an edge that feels like he's just right next to the precipice, while Delgado always felt so controlled. Ainley's master here feels like a madman just keeping it in check, perhaps only so the Doctor won't get one up on him over it. And then NuWho took it way too far and turned the master into a raving nutcase, but never mind. Overall, this is a great performance. There are a few more minor things I like. The lesbian subtext between Ace and Kara, for instance, is a nice bit of representation in an era where it was not often found on TV, although given the subtext is very often rather more just text. It's surprising Munro has admitted there was more she had to cut out. What, did they just flat out kiss at one point? But yes, I think that's effective for both humanising the cheaters and giving Ace some depth. The dialogue is usually quite sharp, and certainly the story always has energy and drive. It's always entertaining, even if the pace doesn't quite work, so yeah, there's all the good things about it. Which does bring us to some drawbacks, and these mostly come out in the structure and pacing. Again, I suspect at least some of this was Cartmel cutting shit for time, but if he did that, his priorities were a bit off as a lot of irrelevancy stayed in. The shop scene should have been the bit the dust, and maybe would have done if comedians Hale and Pace hadn't been drafted in on one last bit of JNT stunt casting before the show ended, but then maybe not. Part 1 probably didn't need much cutting given how slow it feels and how much time feels wasted there. And yeah, I think the uneven pace and sloppy structure are probably the biggest weakness of this. Part 1 feels slow, which is fine, but is a whole third of the story with this format, and doesn't feel like it builds quite as effectively as it probably should. Contrast with Part 2, which does move very well, but it feels like all it does is build towards and move to something, which is something we never really get, as Part 3 suddenly swerves away and has a lot of new plot elements without quite finishing up the ones it had already brought up. It's just a very unevenly paced story with a structure that just doesn't work. The story is both too fast and too slow depending on when you get to it. And while there's a lot of moments the work is fast and a lot of the work is slow, there's not enough control or thought to it. And again, a lot of this is because of the format, I know, so it's not entirely blamed on Cartmel and a production team, but I can't help the feeling this maybe needed a bit more editing and a bit more drafting to really get the best out of it in this regard. The big picture, though, is that this contributes to the disjointed, confusing feel a lot of the story has, which unfortunately is another of those recurring McCoy-era problems they never quite got a grip on. Stop happening for no apparent reason that feels like we're supposed to be getting. The Doctor, for instance, spending most of Part 1 pretending to be the cat whisperer goes beyond the centric behaviour into making him like an escaped mental patient, and it's not as if he is revealed to know what's going on the whole time, or anything to at least partially justify this. He's as surprised as anyone else, so it feels like we're either missing something in all this, or we're just acting weird for weird's sake. Neither is a great sign. It also doesn't help when the story decides to just grind itself to a halt and add nothing, which makes us all wonder when is this going to get on with it. Sure, Hale and Pace were popular in the late 80s, but did we really need a several-minute-long shop scene with them that establishes nothing that could have been done much quicker and more effectively elsewhere? But even all that's just the earlier part of the story, which does build things up okay and keep things up until we get to the later part when it all just kind of falls apart. The amount of shit that ends up being completely unexplained makes the story just completely disintegrate, and ends up being disjointed and verging on incomprehensible. Again, stuff is just happening cause. In fact, I almost considered giving this one a Spanish Flea plot hole segment, which is not something I would consider doing for the classic series lightly, but in the end I decided it would be self-indulgent, and perhaps a little unfair. This isn't on the level of Aliens London World War III or In the Forest of the Night. Frankly, it's not even in the same fucking universe, and, well, I mentioned self-indulgent, I already did the Monty Python parody skit at the beginning, so... But I will point out, the nature of the cheetah planet is confusing and contradictory. It feels like we need a bit more explanation for Kara turning human not to elicit a "huh" among the audience rather than the intended emotional reaction. All the important explanations get glossed over. The cheetah planet has a power. Don't ask more any of that, it's just a power. The civilization that eventually became the cheetah people was just sort of there and thought they could control it somehow and didn't. And frankly, even the link between the set of ruins the Master shows the Doctor and the cheetah people is not as strong as it should be, not even close. In the end, this isn't just important to add depth for the story, to make it feel more real, although it is important to do that. It's also just to make the actual events feel coherent. Like suddenly the cheetah people aren't doing stuff there was no setup for them to do before and stuff like that. There are also other plot events that just feel in the same way that's like happening cause. Midge dying because the Master told him to die. Yes, I know, it was supposed to be a more gruesome death and it had to be changed, but how about changing it to something better suited than the bit from Life of Brian where the gladiator has a cardiac arrest? Or I always hear about the motorcycle crashes where two motorcycles collide and then fucking explode, sending their riders in a cartoon flight path to land safely on a conveniently dumped sofa. Or was that an episode of Looney Tunes? I forget. So yeah, overall, as I said, just basic errors, things to be tidied up in the scripting phase to make the story feel just a bit too disjointed and muddled to really work. Like it needed one more polish to really find its potential when, yeah, that probably was it. As an end to the classic series, Survival I think is an appropriate story. It shows the classic series' strengths that they always were. It showed how it evolved and changed and adapted, and also how it could be flawed as well. But in the end, I think it showed promise, imagination, and engagement, and it's not often you could not ask that from the classic series. Whatever its flaws, and there are quite a few, I'm grateful it ended Doctor Who's original, and for me personally certainly never to be surpassed, run in a dignified way, just happy to tell a story and engage its audience. Its final scene, where the Seventh Doctor sums up to Ace all that he stands for and strives to do, is a perfect capstone to the series. Even if yes, it's an obviously rushed dub where McCoy is very clearly not saying anything on location, the dubbing couldn't be more obvious, but who cares, because it brings things to an end without bringing them to an end. There's always more work to do. And in the end, I think that message, that despite the show coming to an end, it had proved there was still life in it, means that the legacy of it and its dedicated fanbase kept going past 1989. And in the end were instrumental in keeping it alive until it returned to our screens in 2005. Yes, the Wilderness years had their embarrassments, dimensions in time for one thing, but also in the fan behaviour. The shock at losing the show that had been ever-present drove many fans somewhat insane in the early years. Stories like fans calling up the BBC to abuse them about the show being off the air and all that. And to compare to 2026, yes, we now have the internet and decades of Doctor Who content at our fingertips, which will make the whole thing much calmer and less urgent, which will probably help the case for the show's return when the time is right. And yes, NuWho proved Doctor Who can be the most popular thing on TV again, and with that precedent set, a future third iteration of the series won't need to prove that point quite as much. But in 1989 there was the message that the story never ends, that the work always goes on, and survival was a fitting and dignified end, compared to the embarrassing travesty that was the reality war, and its Hail Mary arsepool ending by a desperate and creatively bankrupt showrunner that has now left the fanbase without a current Doctor to make any new stories from. And well, perhaps that just means we'll do things differently, that the path the fans take the series in its absence from our screens will be a different one. But overall, it leaves things on a more worrying, less positive note. But in hindsight, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Who knows what the future holds, and what we can learn from the past, and we can know that the Doctor will always return. As for survival, I'm going to give this one a final score of 6 out of 10, which means it's slightly above average by the standards of the classic series. It's a fine, entertaining piece, which does a great job of character work, themes and ideas, and presents a competent, engaging story that is never an unpleasant watch. It just could and certainly should have been a lot more than it is, had a few elementary issues been dealt with early on in the scripting phase. But it could have been more, but that doesn't take away from what it is. It's a dignified and fitting end to an unbeatable 26 years. Of course, being the Seventh Doctor's final TV story, minus his brief trip to San Francisco in a TV movie, this is the place to talk about his legacy, which is, I have to admit, something I'd completely forgotten I'd have to do when I chose this story to review, but that's fine because it's an interesting topic to talk about, and one I will no doubt return to in much greater detail at some point beyond this short 5-minute bit here. The Seventh Doctor's era started very badly, there's no doubt about that at all. As it was a show that was still imploding in on itself, with an incompetent producer being the last man standing with the tattered remains of the show at his feet. The result was season 24, a complete disaster of idiotic storytelling, laughable, stupid scripts, so the closest the show has ever come just being an outright parody of itself, and a sense that nobody involved has had even the slightest interest in taking it seriously, or actually trying to do anything interesting with the series. I mean, sure, Dragonfire is a masterpiece, but only in the same way The Room is a masterpiece, and the other 3 stories aren't even funny bad, they're just plain embarrassing. See my review of Paradise Towers for how I feel about that. And stuck in the middle of that was Sylvester McCoy, who, let's be honest, did not give good performances in that first year. And I want to make it clear that was in no way his fault. He was just not being given any direction of what to do with the character, and what he was meant to be. So he just defaulted into his light entertainment shtick and hoped for the best, and it just didn't work. The Doctor seemed like a bad clown, the kind of comedian at the village fete your grandparents took you to, who you can only just groan at and hope it ends quickly. But things did change very rapidly once Cartmel would gently kick JNT upstairs and started to clear out the rot, and season 25 showed that there was life in the show yet. Yes, as I made clear earlier in the review, this came with its own pitfalls, and those 2 seasons were very far from perfect. Even away from the fact I'm not as fond of it as most other people. Most people agree Silver Nemesis is a dud and that Battlefield is an acquired taste to say the least, but obviously in my opinion none of them really do anything to deserve more than a 7 out of 10. But in the end, that's just an objective hindsight view, because what those stories did was breathe new life into the show, reinvigorate and give it something new to do, and indeed, new mistakes to make. And at the heart of this was Sylvester McCoy, who now suddenly with direction was able to really hone in his performance, and despite an over-the-top moment here or there which we can forgive, really made the part of the Doctor his own. The cafe scene in Remembrance of the Daleks showed what he could do when he was a quiet, considered, and contemplative, showing that the Doctor was far more than what he appeared and was no longer just an annoying clown that he'd been in the season before. I think for a lot of people this is where he became the Doctor, and had many of these scenes where he showed the depth and humanity that his Doctor really needed from the start. His scenes of Ace and Ghostlight, for instance, are excellent in this regard. And while the Chessmaster stuff was played into the Cartmel master plan, it never really quite clicked, and led to the Doctor maybe feeling more distant than he should. I think we nevertheless shouldn't let the extremes this led to in the expanded universe cloud how it was on TV, where it was a lot more restrained and more logical with how the character was portrayed. He was darker and manipulative, yes, and the Curse of Fenric showed that, but there was always the feeling there was nevertheless a sense of compassion to it, that he was concerned for Ace really, and that while he would use her to achieve his ends, he wouldn't abandon or discard her either. As I've said, I didn't repeat the mistake with the Sixth Doctor, where he felt like it was an arse from day one, that he attempts to gradually go out of him failed. There was always the nuanced feeling, always the feeling that the Chessmaster did care. Again, they were making new mistakes. And whatever you can say about how extreme it got in the EU sometimes, I think it's easy to forget, but before 1989, there wasn't really an EU for Doctor Who. That McCoy was the incumbent Doctor for those 7 years prior to the TV movie meant that fan writers took over the story after the TV show ended. They were able to build on what had been put together during those 2 seasons. Not always with the best results. The Virgin New Adventures are looking back pretty embarrassing, let's be honest, but nevertheless it meant that the 7th Doctor became the Doctor for the fans of that era, and became just as iconic for those fans as all the others. While there may always be the unfair stench of failure in McCoy among the general public, for the fact that he was the last classic Doctor, for the fans that'll never be the case. He'll always be a beloved Doctor, not least because, like the 5th and 6th Doctors, he was able to build up that legacy with Big Finish, to add even more classic stories to his repertoire, and develop and explore new places for the character to go. He started terribly, and the show was never really a good place for him to thrive, sure. But everything that's come in seasons 25 and 26, and everything that came afterwards, has shown us that this was where the show finally started to find himself. It was no fluke. And there was so much of the credit going to McCoy there, for the 7th Doctor just being an engaging and interesting Doctor. The 7th Doctor was, I think, the classic series' final success, and just like everything it brought us, has become immortal as a result.